6 letters, that is all it took. In one Latverian file, marked for a single set of eyes, a report on a captured piece of Stark technology is filed under 6 letters. Not a threat. Not encrypted with triple redundancy. Not flagged for a war room. 6 letters, stamped by an aide who had learned over years of service exactly how little his employer respected the House of Stark. The device sits in a drawer for 11 days before anyone in the castle looks at it again. 11 days. That is the gap this story lives inside. Because in 11 days, in whichever timeline you choose to measure it from, an Iron Man suit can be rebuilt, a signal can be traced, a friendship or the wreckage of one can be turned into a weapon, and a man who believes himself the smartest person in every room he has ever entered will discover again that dismissal is the one mistake he keeps making and never seems to learn from. This is a story about being underestimated. It just happens to be about the man who does the underestimating. Victor Von Doom has never lost a war he took seriously. He has, however, lost repeatedly across decades, across universes, across timelines that don't even share the same laws of physics, to a man in a metal suit that Doom insists every single time is beneath him. Not a worthy rival, not a scientific equal, a toymaker, a rich man playing soldier, a distraction from the real work of Empire. He has said some version of this line in Latverian, in English, in the cold formal French of old diplomatic cables. Stark is not my equal, he is my inconvenience. He has been wrong every time he said it. How a rivalry built entirely on one man's contempt became the only fight in the Marvel Universe that has been fought and lost by Doom in nearly every version of reality where both men exist, that starts, like most things involving Victor Von Doom, with a fire. Chapter 1. The Wound That Wears a Mask. Before there was armor, there was a face. Before the face was ruined, there was a mother. Cynthia Von Doom died young in the Latverian hills at the hands, or so the boy Victor came to believe, of a demon she had summoned in desperation, trying to save her dying husband with magic she did not fully understand. Werner Von Doom, a healer, a good man by every account that survives him, watched his wife die for trying to save him and never forgave himself for it. He raised his son alone in poverty in a Romani encampment that the state of Latveria tolerated the way a boot tolerates a stone in its path, barely and with visible irritation. Victor grew up watching his father humiliated by men with less skill and more title. He grew up watching the machinery of power reward cruelty and punish competence, and somewhere in that childhood a conviction took root that would outlive every version of the boy who first believed it. The world does not simply fail to recognize genius. The world actively despises it and punishes it, unless genius seizes the crown for itself. This is the wound. Everything after is the scar tissue built around it. By the time Victor was a teenager, his intellect had already outpaced every tutor Latveria could offer him. He built devices from scrap that should not have worked and did. He read forbidden texts on sorcery not because he believed in mysticism for its own sake, but because he refused to accept that any discipline, magic, science, statecraft, could hold answers he was not entitled to master. A scholarship eventually took him to America, to a university that a certain other student also happened to attend. His name was Reed Richards. It matters here only briefly, because this is not that story, but it matters because it establishes the pattern that will define everything that follows with Stark, decades later, in every reality where the pattern repeats. Victor Von Doom met a rival whose gifts rivaled his own, and instead of collaboration, instead of even simple respect, he treated the mere existence of an equal as an insult. Richards warned him that his calculations for a dimensional travel experiment were flawed. Victor, certain of his own perfection, proceeded anyway. The explosion that followed did not kill him, it simply took his face and handed him, in its place, the first mask he ever wore willingly. A mask made not of iron, but of the certainty that he had been sabotaged rather than simply wrong. It was not an accident he caused, it was an experiment Richards ruined out of jealousy. That is the story Victor told himself. It was not true, but it was necessary, because a man who believes himself infallible cannot survive contact with a mistake that scars his own face without inventing someone else to blame for it. He fled into the mountains of Tibet after that, to monks who taught him true sorcery, who forged him a mask of iron with their own hands, a mask he heated red hot and pressed to his ruined face before it had fully cooled, scarring himself a second time, permanently, in a decision so purely, tragically Victor that every biographer who has studied it since has struggled to decide whether it was punishment or armor or both at once. He became Dr. Doom. He returned to Latveria. He overthrew its government within a season, crowned himself both king and sorcerer-scientist sovereign, and built out of one nation's borders the only kingdom on Earth run entirely according to the logic of his own genius. He was, by every metric that mattered to him, correct that he was extraordinary. He would spend the rest of his existence extraordinarily wrong about nearly everyone he considered beneath him. Which brings us, finally, to a different genius, a different orphan of sorts, not of blood, but of accountability, a boy who inherited a company before he had finished mourning his parents, and built, out of his own scars, a very different kind of mask. Chapter 2, The Toymaker, Doom Refuses to Take Seriously. Tony Stark's origin does not need retelling in full here. It has been told well elsewhere, on other nights, in other scripts. What matters for this story is narrower and stranger, the exact moment Victor Von Doom first became aware of him, and the exact shape of the contempt that moment produced. Accounts differ slightly depending on which continuity you're tracing. Mainstream Marvel continuity places an early confrontation not long after Stark first appears publicly as Iron Man, while the Ultimate Universe's version pushes the first contact later into a period where Stark's technology has already begun outpacing state actors' ability to regulate it. But the shape of Doom's reaction is, with almost eerie consistency across realities, identical. He does not see a threat. He sees a hobbyist. In Doom's private assessments, logged in several archived Latverian state records later recovered by international intelligence services during a brief period of détente in the mid-2000s, Stark is described not as a rival scientist, not as a strategist, not even as a soldier. He is described as a man who solved a survival problem and mistook the solution for mastery. Doom's read on the arc reactor, according to these same records, was that it represented competent engineering wrapped around a fundamentally undisciplined mind. A mind that built weapons first and asked philosophical questions about their use only after the fact, if at all. It is worth sitting with how wrong and how revealing that assessment turns out to be. Because Victor Von Doom has never once, in any version of his life, questioned the philosophy of his own rule after the fact. He built Latveria's authoritarian machine with total confidence, and every subsequent action he has taken has been in service of proving that confidence correct rather than examining it. Tony Stark, whatever his flaws, and they are legion, and this story will not flinch from them, is a man whose entire adult life has been a slow, halting, frequently disastrous process of reassessing his own certainty. He builds a weapon and watches it fall into the wrong hands, and spends the next decade of his life trying to control the consequences. He designs an artificial intelligence to protect the world and watches it decide the world needs protecting from people like him. He gets it wrong, repeatedly, publicly, catastrophically, and then does something Victor Von Doom has never once managed to do. He changes his mind. It was not weakness. It was the one trait Doom could never simulate, no matter how many minds he claimed to have mastered. Say that once, it will matter more the second time, and more still the third. Their first real confrontation, the one most consistently referenced across mainstream continuity, is not a war. It is smaller than that, almost administrative in its origins, and this matters because it establishes the register the entire rivalry will play in for years afterward. Not two titans clashing over the fate of worlds, but one titan condescending to notice a colleague he considers unworthy of the word. Latveria, under Doom's rule, had acquired, through channels that remain disputed to this day, a piece of prototype Stark technology, not weapons grade, not even particularly advanced by Doom's own standards, a guidance system, elegant in its simplicity, that Stark Industries had developed and, crucially, scrapped, judging it too unstable for production use. Doom's engineers reverse-engineered it in days. Doom himself reviewed their work personally, expecting, by his own later admission, extracted years afterward under circumstances this script will return to find either brilliance worth acquiring or incompetence worth mocking. He found neither. He found caution. The guidance system had been abandoned not because Stark's team couldn't make it work, but because Stark himself had flagged a failure mode that would, under specific conditions, cause catastrophic harm to civilian infrastructure. A failure mode so narrow, so statistically improbable, that virtually any other defense contractor on Earth would have shipped the product anyway and accepted the risk as a cost of doing business. Stark killed a working weapon over a risk most engineers would have called acceptable. Doom did not know what to do with that information. It did not fit his model, a model that would go on across every subsequent encounter in every timeline where this rivalry plays out, to keep not fitting, no matter how many times reality corrected it. He filed the discovery away with something between irritation and unwilling curiosity, and turned his attention elsewhere. Latveria had larger concerns than a toymaker's scruples. It was not true that Doom forgot him. It only looked that way from the outside, in the same way a tide looks still from the shore right before it turns. Chapter 3: First Contact and the Judgment that Started the Clock. The confrontation that actually brings them into the same room, the one most timelines agree on, in broad strokes if not in exact staging, begins with a hostage situation that was never really about hostages. Doom, testing the political waters of an emerging global technology regulation summit, orchestrates the seizure of a facility connected to a Stark Industries subcontractor, publicly framed as a Latverian sovereignty dispute over patent rights, privately understood by every intelligence agency watching as a message: do not build things that make my kingdom obsolete without my permission. Stark arrives predictably in the suit. What follows is not, by the standards of the battles this story will eventually escalate to, a particularly long fight. Doom's forces are competent but not overwhelming. The facility's defenses are calibrated more for negotiation leverage than genuine destruction. Stark neutralizes the immediate threat with the kind of improvisational, slightly reckless competence that will define nearly every early-era confrontation across every continuity this story touches. He is faster than Doom's engineers accounted for. He is more creative under pressure than the intelligence report suggested. And when Doom himself finally appears, not to fight but to observe, cloaked from a command position, what he sees unsettles something in him that he will spend years refusing to name. He sees a man improvising a solution to a problem Doom's own scientists had spent months designing around. Doom's assessment afterward, delivered to his war council with the flat, unshakable authority he brings to every pronouncement, whether about physics or prophecy. Stark is a gifted amateur. He will not survive contact with a serious mind. That is the dismissive judgment. Say it once, here, clearly, because the rest of this story is built entirely to disprove it. It was not true. It had never been true. But it would take Victor von Doom, a man who has rewritten history itself rather than admit an error, the better part of several decades, several realities, and at least one full timeline reset to even begin suspecting it. The clock the summary spoke of does not start ticking with a bang, it starts with paperwork. Because after that first skirmish, something small and in retrospect enormously consequential happens. Stark, rather than escalating publicly, rather than feeding the confrontation to the press the way Doom expected, the way Doom frankly wanted, because a public war is a war he understands the rules of, instead files a quiet series of technology transfer restriction requests through 3 separate international bodies, each one narrowly targeting a category of dual-use hardware Latveria had been quietly importing. It is not a superhero move, it is a business move. And it is devastating in a way Doom does not fully register for months because he is watching for armor, and instead what arrives is oversight. Supply lines that took Doom's engineers years to establish begin drying up, one licensing dispute at a time. Not destroyed, Doom's kingdom is far too self-sufficient and far too resourceful for anything so simple as a single choke point to cripple it, but slowed, taxed, made expensive in a currency more valuable to Doom than money, time. Somewhere in a Latverian archive, a report crosses a minister's desk noting the pattern and recommending it be escalated to His Majesty's personal attention. It is stamped by an aide who understands his employer's contempt for the man causing all this trouble with 6 letters. Not a threat. It sits in a drawer. The story we are telling begins to gather itself in the dark, the way stories do, quietly, while the people inside it are busy being certain of things that are not true. Chapter 4. The report Doom finally reads. 11 days is not a long time to a man who has, at various points in his long and contradictory existence, bent time itself to his purposes. 11 days is nothing, and yet it is exactly long enough for a supply chain irritation to become, in Victor von Doom's private accounting, something closer to a pattern he can no longer dismiss. He reads the report on the 12th day, not the 11th, because on the 11th day he is occupied with a border dispute involving a neighbouring state whose king made the mistake of underestimating him in an entirely different, entirely more conventional way. That king's mistake resolves itself quickly and predictably, and is not the subject of this story. What matters is that by the time Doom finally turns his attention to the 6 letters an aide had stamped across a routine supply chain memorandum, 3 additional licensing bodies have quietly restricted Latverian access to components Doom's engineers considered, until recently, entirely uncontested. He does not raise his voice when he reads it. Those closest to him have learned, over years of service, that Doom's rage announces itself in stillness first, in the particular quiet of a man recalculating an equation he had assumed was already solved. He reads the report twice. He asks of no one in particular, a question his aide will later describe, carefully to a historian working decades afterward under diplomatic immunity, as the first time he had ever heard Dr. Doom sound almost curious rather than commanding. How long has the toymaker been doing this to me? It was not a rhetorical question, though it read like one. It was the sound of a man discovering that a rival he had filed under contempt had, without any fanfare at all, been quietly, patiently, methodically making his kingdom smaller. It was not weakness that had let Stark's countermeasures work. It was the same quality Doom had dismissed as amateurish restraint back at that ruined subcontractor facility, a willingness to solve a problem without spectacle, without a throne, without needing the world to watch him do it. Doom's entire model of power required an audience. Stark's did not. And a man who needs the world to see his victories will always be, at least a little, blind to the victories no one was watching him win. Say that once, it will matter again. What Doom does next is, in its way, the most honest thing he ever does regarding Tony Stark, and it happens entirely without an audience, which is precisely why almost no biographer catches it. He does not declare war, he does not summon his war council. He goes alone to a private observatory in the highest tower of his castle, and he spends 4 uninterrupted hours reviewing every scrap of intelligence Latveria has gathered on Stark Industries. Not the weapons, not the armor schematics his engineers had already dissected years ago, but the pattern, the choices, the technology Stark killed rather than shipped, the lawsuits Stark settled rather than fought, when settling meant admitting fault publicly at cost to his own company's stock. The employees Stark kept on the payroll during a catastrophic year of losses, against the advice of every board member urging layoffs. None of it fits the model of gifted amateur. All of it fits a different model entirely, one Doom does not want to name, because naming it means admitting that the man he mocked as a toymaker has been operating according to a discipline every bit as rigorous as Doom's own, just aimed at different ends. It was not that Stark lacked ambition. It was that his ambition kept bending, stubbornly, inconveniently, toward restraint. And restraint, to a man who has never once restrained himself from anything he believed he deserved, looks at first like weakness, and only much later, if the man is honest, which Victor von Doom very rarely is, even with himself, starts to look like the discipline he has spent his whole life claiming to possess and never quite earning. He closes the file before dawn. He does not sleep. And when his war council convenes the following morning, Dr. Doom issues an order that surprises every person in the room, because it is not a declaration of war. It is a directive to observe, track Stark's movements, catalogue his failures publicly and privately, build a complete profile, not of his weapons, which Doom's engineers already understand intimately, but of the man. Before I destroy him, Doom tells his council, in the flat, certain tone he uses for prophecy and physics alike, I will understand exactly what it is I am destroying. It was the closest thing to respect Victor Von Doom had ever paid a man he still on the surface refused to consider his equal, and it would take him years and several entirely different versions of the man in the armor to discover that understanding Tony Stark and defeating Tony Stark were not, as Doom assumed, the same task at all. Chapter 5: The Trial of the Ultimate Divide. The first true war between them. Not a skirmish, not a probing exchange over supply lines, but an actual, sustained, world-endangering conflict takes place in the timeline many chroniclers consider the clearest test case in the Ultimate Universe, a reality where the distance between Stark's confidence and Stark's competence runs narrower and more dangerous than almost anywhere else he exists. This version of Tony Stark is younger when the armor first appears, more reckless, more publicly arrogant in a way that gives Doom, watching from Latveria, exactly the confirmation bias he has been hunting for. Here is a Stark who drinks too much, who treats the suit as much as spectacle as shield, who picks fights with governments as readily as with supervillains, seemingly for the theatre of it. Doom's intelligence reports on this version of his rival read, for a time, like vindication. This, Doom tells his council, is the toymaker I always understood him to be. It is worth pausing on how badly that reading will age. Because this Ultimate Universe Doom, when he finally strikes, engineering a diplomatic incident that escalates within days into full military confrontation between Latveria and a coalition led by the United States, with Stark's technology as the tip of the spear, walks into the conflict having built his entire strategy on a version of Tony Stark that no longer exists by the time the missiles are in the air, because the man in the suit that meets him is not the reckless showman from the intelligence file. He is a man who has already, in this timeline, watched his own technology used against people he cared about. He has already buried friends. He has already had the specific private reckoning that every version of Tony Stark eventually has, in every reality where he survives long enough to have it. The reckoning where the suit stops being a toy and starts being an apology he can never quite finish making. Doom's opening gambit is, by any technical measure, superior. His forces are better prepared, his intelligence more thorough, his opening strike more devastating in raw terms than anything Stark's coalition anticipated. Latverian records from this campaign, records Doom himself, tellingly, never had sealed, a detail historians still debate the meaning of Sesh, described the first 6 hours of the engagement as a rout. And then something happens that Doom's model did not account for, because Doom's model was built on a man who no longer existed. Stark adapts live, mid-battle, redesigning his suit's defensive protocols in real time based on data from the first engagement, a capability Doom's own intelligence had flagged as theoretically possible but practically unlikely, given how rushed and improvisational this younger Stark's engineering process had always appeared to be. It was not recklessness. It had never been recklessness. It was the same trait Doom would keep mistaking for its opposite in every subsequent encounter, the willingness to be wrong quickly in public at cost to his own ego in order to be right in time to matter. Doom's genius moved slowly and demanded perfection before it acted. Stark's genius, in every version of him this story will visit, moved fast and forgave itself for its own mistakes just long enough to fix them before they became fatal. The battle that follows stretches across 2 days and, by its end, leaves Latverian forces in retreat for the first time in years, not annihilated because Doom is too careful a strategist to allow annihilation, but checked publicly in a way that costs him more than territory. It costs him the narrative he had built for himself, the one where Stark was an amateur who would not survive contact with a serious mind. Doom does survive the retreat. He always does. But something in the after-action reports changes. The word amateur stops appearing in his private assessments. It is replaced quietly, without fanfare, by a colder and more dangerous word, variable. It was not that Doom respected him yet. It would be many trials before respect entered the equation, if it ever fully did, but he had, for the first time, stopped being certain of the outcome before the fight began, and for a man who had organized his entire existence around certainty, that alone was a wound deeper than any battlefield defeat. Chapter 6: The Trial of Extremis and the Cost of Being Right Too Late. If the ultimate confrontation taught Doom that Stark could adapt faster than his intelligence suggested, the next major trial set in mainstream continuity during the period when Stark's body itself becomes inseparable from his technology through the Extremis process, teaches him something harder to accept, that Stark's greatest weapon was never the armor at all. It was his willingness to keep rebuilding himself, literally, physically, at personal cost, rather than accept a version of himself that had stopped working. Doom's interest in Extremis is, in the beginning, purely acquisitive. A technology capable of rewriting human biology at a cellular level, integrating a nervous system directly with mechanical systems. This is not a toymaker's plaything. This is closer than Doom is comfortable admitting, to the kind of transformation his own sorcery has spent decades trying to achieve through entirely different, entirely more painful means. He has scarred his own face with a red-hot mask. Stark had found a way to make the metal part of the man without ever needing the mask at all. It was not envy. Doom would never call it envy, not even in the privacy of his own war room. But the record of what he does next reads, to anyone willing to look honestly at it, exactly like envy wearing a crown. He orchestrates the theft of Extremis research through an intermediary, confident that his own scientific apparatus, refined over decades, will succeed where Stark Industries' security failed to anticipate a threat of Latveria's caliber, and for a time, it works. Doom's engineers make progress reverse engineering the process faster than Stark's own recovery teams can track the breach. Here is the false peak of this particular trial, and it deserves to be named as one. Doom achieves a partial synthesis. He does not complete the Extremis integration. The human cost proves, even by Doom's standards, difficult to justify at scale, a rare moment where his own ambition briefly outpaces his willingness to spend lives on it. But he acquires enough of the underlying science to enhance a cadre of his personal guard with a crude, unstable variant of the technology. It looks on paper like victory, a theft executed cleanly, a capability gained, an advantage secured. It is not resolution, it is a wound left open, dressed up as a win. Because when Stark discovers the breach, and he does discover it faster than Doom's intelligence predicted, because Stark had, quietly, built detection countermeasures into his own research specifically because he did not trust the world to leave it alone. What follows is not the retaliatory strike Doom's War Council braces for. It is worse in a way none of them anticipated. Stark does not attack Latveria. Stark releases, through carefully controlled channels, a partial technical countermeasure, not a weapon, but a patch, a vulnerability disclosure aimed precisely at the specific instability in the stolen research that Doom's rushed synthesis had failed to fully resolve. He does not use it to destroy Doom's enhanced guard. He uses it to offer, publicly, an option. Submit to a medical intervention that stabilizes the technology safely, or risk a degradation timeline that Stark's own data released alongside the offer, with sourcing so thorough that even Latverian scientists cannot dispute it. Projects will be fatal within 18 months. Doom refuses the offer on behalf of his guard, publicly, framing it as Latverian sovereignty over Latverian bodies. Privately, 3 of the 12 enhanced soldiers seek the treatment through back channels Doom's own security apparatus fails to fully close, a detail that reaches him only months later and that he never discusses with anyone ever again. It was not that Stark had defeated him militarily. He hadn't even tried to. It was that Stark had found, once again, a way to be right in a manner that cost Doom something Doom could not simply conquer his way out of. The quiet, corrosive knowledge that his own people had trusted a rival's data over their own king's certainty, because the rival had, once again, told the truth when it would have been easier and safer to let the lie stand. This is the irony stated for the second time, in different words than the first. Doom's power depended on being obeyed. Absolutely. Stark's power, again and again, across every version of this rivalry, depended on being believed. And belief, unlike obedience, has to be earned freshly every single time, in a way that no crown, no mask, no sorcery can shortcut. It was not a battle Doom lost in any conventional sense, but it was the first time he understood, with real clarity, that this rivalry would never be decided by force alone. And that understanding, quiet, unwelcome, filed away without ceremony, would matter more than any single confrontation that came before it. Chapter 6. A. The Trial of the Alliance. Neither man wanted. Not every trial in this long rivalry is a war. Some of the strangest, most instructive chapters in the whole history between Victor Von Doom and the man in the Iron Man armor are the ones where the two of them, for reasons entirely outside either man's control, find themselves standing on the same side of a fight neither of them chose to be fighting. The particular alliance this chapter concerns is forced into being by a threat large enough to make even old, bitter enmities look briefly like luxuries neither side can afford, a cosmic incursion in the telling most chroniclers favor, vast enough and indifferent enough to human affairs that it does not particularly care whether the minds trying to stop it wear crowns or armor, whether they call each other rival or ally, whether they have spent decades of accumulated history dedicated to proving each other wrong. It simply arrives, the way such threats tend to in stories like this one, on a scale that renders the ordinary categories of friend and enemy briefly, uncomfortably irrelevant. Doom's initial reaction to the necessity of this alliance is, predictably, contempt dressed up as pragmatism. He agrees to the arrangement not because any part of him has softened toward his old rival, but because his own private calculations make clear, with the same cold precision he brings to every decision in this story, that Latveria's survival depends on capabilities he cannot currently match alone, and that the fastest path to acquiring them runs directly through the one mind on Earth he has spent this entire rivalry refusing to fully respect. This is not partnership, Doom informs his war council, in an assessment that reads, in hindsight, like a man trying very hard to convince himself of something he does not yet fully believe. It is a temporary alignment of separate interests. Nothing more. It does not stay nothing more, though it takes the crisis itself, rather than either man's own inclination, to force the change. What follows across the days of that alliance, chroniclers differ on exactly how long the crisis lasts, though most accounts agree it stretches long enough for both men to grow visibly, uncharacteristically exhausted by its end, is a slow, grudging, almost accidental education in what the other actually brings to a fight neither of them can win alone. Doom, for his part, discovers something he had not fully accounted for in any of his prior intelligence, that Stark's improvisational genius, the trait Doom had spent years mistaking for recklessness, functions entirely differently when it is not being deployed against him. Watching his old rival redesign a critical piece of shared defensive technology in the middle of active crisis, adapting it on the fly to counter a threat neither side had fully modeled in advance, Doom finds himself, for the first time in this entire story, on the receiving end of a capability he has spent years studying from the outside, and it unsettles him in a way that outright defeat never quite managed to. It is one thing to lose to a mind you have written off as lesser. It is another thing entirely to be saved by it, mid-crisis, in a way that leaves no room to reframe the moment afterward as anything other than exactly what it was. Stark, for his part, discovers something about Doom that unsettles him in a mirror-image way, that the same discipline, the same total, unwavering command of every variable in a room that makes Doom's tyranny so effective also makes him, in a genuine crisis, one of the single most reliable minds Stark has ever fought alongside. Doom does not hesitate. Doom does not second-guess a plan once it has been set in motion. Doom commits absolutely to whatever role the crisis assigns him, without the theatrical flourishes that define nearly every other appearance he makes across this story, because for once, in this specific chapter, there is no audience left to perform for, only the work and the narrowing window of time in which to do it. There is a moment, recorded independently by two separate allies who witnessed it from different vantage points and whose accounts remarkably agree almost word for word on the essential details, that this story returns to now because it may be the single clearest piece of evidence across the entire rivalry that something real passed between these two men during this forced alliance, something neither of them characteristically ever discussed afterward. In the crisis's final, most dangerous hour, with the threat nearly contained and both men's forces stretched to the point of collapse, a critical failure in the shared defensive system threatens to undo everything the Alliance has achieved. There is time for exactly one of them to attempt the repair, and the attempt carries with it a real, substantial risk to whoever makes it. Doom, without consultation, without the customary declaration that might have framed the choice as an assertion of his own superiority, simply moves to make the repair himself. Stark stops him. Not with force. There is no time and no standing for force in that particular moment, but with a single sentence, delivered, according to both surviving accounts, without any of the sharpness that has defined nearly every previous exchange between them across this entire story. You're better positioned to hold the line. I've got this. Trust me. And Doom, Victor Von Doom, a man who has never, in any other chapter of this long history, trusted anyone with anything he was not personally supervising, steps back and lets him. It is worth sitting with how small that moment is and how enormous. No battle turns on it in any way a casual observer would notice. No treaty results from it, no lasting peace, no formal acknowledgement from either side that anything of significance had occurred at all. And yet this story, having traced this rivalry across every reality it can find record of, returns to that single sentence, "Trust me," and that single silent step backward again and again, as perhaps the truest, quietest proof available anywhere in the historical record that the long, slow transformation this essay has been describing was never a single dramatic turning point at all, but 1,000 small moments like this one, most of them never recorded, most of them never even fully noticed by the two men living through them, accumulating patiently across decades until the weight of them finally became impossible for even a king as certain of himself as Victor Von Doom to keep dismissing. The crisis passes. The threat is contained. At a cost this story does not need to itemize in detail to make its point, and when the two men part ways afterward, there is no reconciliation seen. No handshake, no acknowledgement on the record of anything having changed between them. Doom returns to Latveria. Stark returns to the long, ongoing work of being Iron Man in whatever version of the world he currently inhabits. Within months, according to the record, they are adversaries again. In the ordinary sense, this story has spent most of its length describing a Doom scheming, Stark countering, the whole familiar machinery of the rivalry resuming as though the alliance had never happened at all. But it had happened, and this story is not the only account to note that in the years following this particular crisis, something in the character of their ongoing rivalry shifts, subtly, permanently, in ways that later, larger trials, the war that becomes the false peak, the long quiet season in an unwatched workshop, would eventually make undeniable to anyone paying close attention. Doom's contempt from this point forward carries a different weight than it once did. It is still contempt, still cutting, still delivered with all the cold, theatrical precision that has defined his character across every chapter of this story. But underneath it now, for anyone listening closely enough, there is something that was not there before this forced alliance forced two old rivals to discover, briefly, unwillingly, and only under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, exactly how much each of them was capable of trusting the other when trust was the only option left on the table. Say the reframe once more in the form this particular trial earns, quieter than the versions that came before it. It was not that a single crisis taught Doom to respect his rival. It was that a single crisis forced him, for a handful of unglamorous hours, to act as though he already did. And having acted that way once, having felt, even briefly, what it was like to let someone else hold a piece of the outcome he could not fully control, he found he was never quite able to fully unlearn it again. Let the story rest here briefly, before it moves on to the trials still ahead. There is a particular quiet that settles over a battlefield in the hours after a shared crisis has passed. Not the tense, watchful quiet of an unfinished war, and not the celebratory noise of a clean victory either, but something in between, weary and companionable and largely wordless, the sound of exhausted people simply breathing for a little while, without needing to explain themselves to anyone. Smoke, thin and unhurried, rising somewhere in the middle distance from equipment that has finally been allowed to stop working so hard. A sky, scoured briefly clean by whatever cosmic disturbance the crisis involved, beginning slowly to look ordinary again, and two old rivals, a careful distance apart, saying nothing much at all, before turning, each in his own direction, back toward the long, separate, complicated lives waiting for them on the other side of this one strange, shared afternoon. Chapter 7. The Trial of the Man Who Agreed with Doom. Of every version of Tony Stark that Victor Von Doom would eventually cross paths with, there is one he does not fight in the way this story has described so far, because for a brief and unsettling period, this version of Stark does not need to be fought. He needs instead to be watched, the way a man watches a mirror he suspects is lying to him. This is the period sometimes called the Superior Era, a timeline in which Tony Stark, in the aftermath of catastrophic personal and professional collapse, remakes himself into a colder, more controlling architect of order, seizing technological dominance over global security in ways his earlier selves would have recoiled from. He restricts access to advanced technology not through Stark's usual instinct toward careful, principled gatekeeping, but through outright monopoly, insisting, publicly, unapologetically, that the world is safer with power concentrated in hands he alone trusts. It should have been Doom's dream opponent. It should have been proof, finally, of everything Doom had always suspected about the man underneath the armor. And for a short time, it very nearly is. Doom's initial response to this version of Stark is, according to intelligence gathered by rival powers monitoring Latveria during the period, something close to delight. Here at last is a Stark who has stopped pretending restraint was a virtue and started behaving openly like a man who believes he alone should hold the reins of the world. Doom even, in a diplomatic communication later leaked through channels neither government has ever fully acknowledged, extends something resembling an overture, not an alliance. Doom would never call it that, but an acknowledgement. A single sentence, cold and precise, translated from the original Latverian. You have finally understood the shape of the crown. Wear it honestly, and we need not be enemies. Stark's reply, delivered publicly rather than through the private channel Doom had used, is shorter and more damaging to Doom's read of him than any battlefield loss could have been. I'm not building a crown, I'm building a lock. There's a difference, and you've never once understood it. It was not agreement Doom had found. It only looked, for a season, like agreement, the way a held breath looks, for a moment like calm before anyone realizes it is a symptom of something closer to panic. Because what Doom's intelligence failed to register, what nearly every observer failed to register, including, for a time, Stark himself, is that this superior period was never Stark discovering that Doom's worldview had been right all along. It was Stark, in crisis, having lost the internal argument he'd been having with himself since the very first time he put on the armor. The argument between the part of him that wanted to fix the world by empowering it, and the part of him, older and more frightened, that believed the only truly safe world was one he personally controlled every variable of. Doom recognized the second voice. He had built an entire kingdom around never silencing it. What Doom did not anticipate, what none of his models accounted for because none of his models allowed for the possibility, was that this version of Stark would eventually recognize that same voice as a threat to be defeated rather than an instinct to be indulged. The turn, when it comes, is not a battle against Doom directly. It is smaller than that, and in its way, more devastating to Doom's understanding of his rival than any war could be. Stark, confronted by allies who once trusted him and no longer do, chooses, deliberately, at enormous personal cost, in full knowledge of what it will mean for the empire he has built, to dismantle the very monopoly of control he had spent months constructing. He surrenders leverage a version of Doom would never willingly surrender. He apologizes publicly in terms specific enough that they cannot be mistaken for strategic positioning. Latverian intelligence records this moment with something that reads, if you know how to read between the clinical language of an intelligence brief, almost like bewilderment. Subject voluntarily relinquished operational control at the height of consolidated advantage. No coercive factor identified. Recommend further study. Doom orders the further study. It does not go well, in the sense that matters most. It does not produce an answer that fits his existing model of the man. Because the honest answer, the one Doom's advisors are too careful of their own necks to write plainly in a report meant for a king who does not enjoy being told he has misjudged someone, is simply this. Tony Stark had once again chosen to be right rather than to be safe at a cost his rival would never have paid. It was not that Stark lacked the will to rule the way Doom ruled. For one dark season, he very nearly had it. It was that, given the choice between total control and being trusted again by people who mattered to him, he chose the harder, slower, less certain path, the one with no throne at the end of it. Say the reframe now, because this trial earns it more than any before it. It was not that Doom's model of Stark was wrong about what the man was capable of. It was wrong about what the man would choose every single time it mattered when the two paths finally diverged. Between Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, allow the story to slow just slightly, the way a river slows where it widens before a bend. Nothing dramatic happens in this space. It is simply a place to breathe. Picture, if you will, a Latverian evening, not a battle, not a war room, only a castle settling into its stones the way old buildings do after the heat of the day has gone out of the walls. Somewhere below the tower where Doom keeps his files on a rival he still will not call an equal, rain has begun, the slow, unhurried kind that does not announce itself so much as simply arrive, gathering on the old glass of a window that has watched over that valley for 400 years. A single lamp burns in the high tower. The rest of the castle is dark and quiet, and for a little while, none of it, the armor, the crown, the 6 letters stamped on a forgotten memo, is happening at all. It is only rain and stone and the particular, patient silence of a man who has not yet realized how much of his life he has already spent being wrong about someone he refuses to call a friend, or even honestly, an enemy worth the word. The story will pick back up soon, for now only the rain. Chapter 8. The Trial of the Son Who Inherited the Silence. Not every version of Iron Man that Doom encounters is Tony Stark at all, and the trial that follows may be in its own quiet way the one that unsettles Doom most, because it forces him to confront a version of the rivalry stripped of the one variable he had, by this point, spent years learning to respect: Stark's own presence in the suit. In a future timeline, sometimes cited by chroniclers under the shorthand of the year that names it, the man in the Iron Man armor is not Tony at all, but his estranged son, Arno, a figure raised almost entirely apart from his father, in the shadow of a legacy he neither fully wanted nor fully understood, stepping into the armor not as inheritance but as obligation. After his father's death leaves a vacancy the world refuses to accept as permanent. Doom's interest in this version of events is at first almost sentimental by his standards, which is to say, still cold, still calculating, but tinged with something closer to curiosity than contempt. Here, finally, is proof, or so Doom initially believes, that the qualities he had grudgingly come to respect in Stark were never inherent to the man at all, but simply the product of circumstance, luck, timing, the kind of thing that does not survive being handed down. Arno Stark, in the early records of this period, gives Doom every reason to believe his theory correct. He is colder than his father, more willing to bend rules Tony had treated as sacred. His first confrontations with Doom's forces, smaller in scale than the wars this story has already described, fought more in boardrooms and back channels than open battle, befitting a timeline where global power has consolidated into fewer, more careful hands, show a man who negotiates from self-interest first, sentiment a distant second, if it factors at all. He is his father's technology, Doom notes, in a private assessment that survives only because Doom, characteristically, never expected anyone else to read it, wearing none of his father's weakness. It was not true. It was this time almost true, closer to true than any previous assessment Doom had made of a Stark, and that near miss is exactly what makes this trial matter. Because the turning point of this particular encounter does not come from Arno discovering some inherited nobility his father never taught him directly. It comes from something smaller and stranger, and to a student of this entire rivalry, devastatingly familiar. Arno, in the middle of a conflict with Doom's forces over control of a piece of aging Stark infrastructure neither side particularly needs, but neither side will concede, finds buried in his father's old private files, the report Tony Stark filed decades earlier about the guidance system he killed rather than shipped. The very first piece of Stark technology Doom's engineers had ever reverse-engineered. The discovery that had first, quietly, unsettled Doom's certainty all those years ago. Arno had never known his father chose the harder, more expensive, more reputationally costly path on that project. No one had ever told him. It was not the kind of story that made the history books because caution rarely does. He does not become his father in that moment. Not fully, not permanently. This story will not pretend a single discovered file rewrites a man's whole character. But something in the negotiation shifts. Arno concedes a smaller piece of the infrastructure dispute than Doom's forces had demanded, but he concedes it publicly, and specifically framing the concession not as weakness, but as precedent, a signal deliberately sent that this version of Stark II could be trusted to choose the costly right thing over the easy wrong one, at least when it mattered enough. Doom notices. Of course he notices. Noticing is the one thing Victor Von Doom has never once failed to do, even when understanding lagged years behind. And in a private assessment updated that same week, the word he had used for the Elder Stark years earlier, variable, reappears in the file on the Sun, this time accompanied by a note that reads, in its entirety, "The pattern persists across the bloodline. Investigate whether the trait is taught or whether it is simply what remains when everything else has been stripped away." He never finishes that investigation to his own satisfaction. It is worth sitting with that gently, without rushing past it. Even a man who has rewritten history, bent time, argued philosophy with gods, never once manages to fully answer the question of why the people he keeps underestimating keep choosing, against every incentive Doom can identify, to be decent when decency costs them something real. It was not a mystery Doom could solve with better intelligence. It was not a variable his models had simply failed to weight correctly. It was, though he would never phrase it this way even to himself, a kind of faith, the quiet, repeated, costly choice to act as though trust is worth rebuilding, made over and over by men who had every reason, after everything the world had done to them, to stop believing it was. Chapter 8a. The Trial of the Century That Forgot Him. Not every reality remembers Victor Von Doom the way Latveria's own histories insist he deserves to be remembered, and there is, perhaps, no version of this rivalry that wounds his pride quite as precisely as the one that unfolds nearly 100 years past the point where most tellings of his story end. By the time the calendar reads 2099, in the timeline most chroniclers cite when discussing this era, the world has changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the young man who first pressed a red-hot mask to his own ruined face. Corporations, not kings, hold the kind of unaccountable power Doom once considered the exclusive province of sovereign will. Latveria itself survives in this era more as an old and half-forgotten name in a database than as the living, breathing seat of absolute rule it once was. A detail the Doom of this century discovers slowly, and processes with an anger that takes even his own advisors by surprise, precisely because it is not the anger of a man losing a battle. It is the anger of a man discovering that the entire war he built his life around has quietly moved on without waiting for him to finish fighting it. Into this changed world steps a new Iron Man, not Tony Stark, not Arno, not any bloodline Doom's intelligence has ever tracked, but a corporate age inventor whose relationship to the armor is shaped less by inheritance and more by circumstance, a mind that came to the suit sideways through ambition and accident in roughly equal measure, the way so many origins in this particular century tend to unfold. Doom's first encounter with this version of the armor is, by the standards of every prior trial this story has traced, almost anticlimactic. A border dispute over decommissioned satellite technology, resolved within hours, notable mainly for how quickly this new Iron Man de-escalates a confrontation Doom, out of old habit, had expected to escalate. It is worth pausing on that de-escalation, because it is the detail that unsettles Doom more than the outcome of the skirmish itself. This is a version of the mantle worn by someone who has never heard the name Victor Von Doom spoken with the particular weight it carried in earlier centuries. To this inventor, Doom is not a legendary rival, not a generational nemesis, not even really a significant threat. He is simply an old, well-armored aggressor whose reputation has not kept pace with his actual capabilities in a century that has quietly moved past him in a dozen small technical ways he has not yet fully accounted for. Doom's private assessment from this period, recovered decades later from an archive that survived the intervening turbulence better than most records from that century, reads with an unusual, almost wounded candor. The armor is competent, the mind behind it is unremarkable, and yet I cannot make them afraid of me, and I do not yet understand why that troubles me as much as it does. It was not that this new Iron Man was Doom's intellectual equal in the specific dangerous way the earlier Starks in this story had been. It was, instead, something quieter and in its own way more corrosive to Doom's self-image, a rival who did not need to fear him in order to defeat him, because the currency Doom's entire reputation had always traded in, awe, dread, the specific gravity of a name spoken carefully by people who understood exactly what it meant to cross him, had simply stopped circulating the way it once had. The turning point of this trial arrives not through a battle Doom loses outright, but through a negotiation he loses without quite realizing until it is already finished that he has been negotiating at all. Seeking to reclaim territorial and technological leverage that had slipped away from Latveria's diminished standing in this era, Doom proposes what he frames, privately, as an old-fashioned show of strength, a demonstration engagement calculated to remind the corporate powers of this century exactly what his name used to mean. The new Iron Man, rather than meeting the demonstration with the kind of dramatic countermeasure Doom's models anticipated, responds instead with something almost bureaucratic in its precision, a public technical audit of Doom's proposed engagement, broadcast through channels this century's information networks make impossible to fully suppress, methodically demonstrating, line by line, exactly how outdated Doom's threatened capabilities actually were compared to current defensive standards. It was not a battle. It was closer to a correction, the kind a patient teacher offers a student who has, through no fault of anyone in the room, simply fallen behind the material, and it lands, according to every surviving account from Doom's own court in this era, harder than any of the earlier, more dramatic defeats this story has traced. Because Doom had built an entire identity, across centuries by this point, around being the one constant in a shifting world, the mind too vast, too disciplined, too far ahead of its time to ever be rendered obsolete by the simple passage of years. And here, for the first time in this long story, a version of Iron Man defeats him not through cleverness, not through moral resolve, not through any of the qualities the earlier trials had slowly taught him to respect, but simply by existing in a present that had quietly, without asking his permission, moved on. He does not concede gracefully. This story has never claimed Victor Von Doom learns his lessons gracefully, in any era, in any reality. He retreats to what remains of Latveria's old infrastructure and spends the better part of a year, an eternity by the standards of a man who has previously resolved entire wars in a matter of days, rebuilding quietly, methodically, not toward another confrontation with this indifferent new century's Iron Man, but towards something closer to relevance itself. And it is here, in the strange, humbling margins of this particular trial, that this story's central irony finds one of its sharpest, least expected expressions. Say it in this new form, because the century demands a new phrasing. It was not that Doom's power had been defeated by a stronger version of his rival. It was that the very qualities Doom mocked in the earliest Stark of this story, the willingness to adapt, to update, to let old certainties go rather than defend them past their expiration, turned out to be the only qualities capable of surviving the passage of a century Doom himself had assumed his genius would simply outlast on its own. He learns it eventually, in his own way, in his own time, the way Doom has learned every hard lesson across this long story, slowly, privately, and without ever quite admitting out loud to anyone that he has learned it at all. Chapter 8b. The Trial of the Student Doom Never Meant to Take. There is one version of this rivalry that Victor Von Doom, by every surviving account, finds harder to reconcile with his own self-image than almost any other, not because the opponent in question is more powerful than the versions of Stark this story has already traced, but because she arrives at the armor by a path that runs, in ways Doom recognizes immediately and resents just as immediately, uncomfortably close to his own. She is young when Doom first encounters her, younger by a significant margin than any other wearer of the mantle this story has visited. A prodigy from a modest background, entirely self-taught in the earliest years of her genius, building early prototypes of advanced technology not in a corporate lab with Stark Industries' full resources behind her, but in circumstances closer to the ones that shaped Doom's own childhood than either of them, in the beginning, is willing to admit. She does not inherit the mantle so much as she earns it, piece by piece, through sheer application of a mind the wider world had, for years, mostly failed to notice. Doom's intelligence flags her first, not as a threat, but as a curiosity, a data point in the ongoing profile Latveria has maintained on Stark-adjacent technology since the earliest chapters of this story. The initial assessment, dry and clinical in the manner of every such file this story has quoted, notes simply, subject's early work demonstrates unusual resourcefulness given documented resource constraints, recommend continued observation. It is the phrase resource constraints that, in hindsight, should have told Doom everything he needed to know about how this particular trial would eventually unfold, and it is worth sitting with the quiet cruelty of the fact that it did not, that a man who had spent his own childhood watching his father humiliated by men with more title and less skill somehow failed, for longer than any reasonable accounting can excuse, to recognize the shape of his own early story reflected back at him in someone else's file. Their first direct encounter comes not through battle, but through something closer to theft, an attempt by Latverian agents to acquire early prototype technology from this young inventor's own modest workshop, an Operation Doom's advisors frame in the planning stages, as a low-risk acquisition against a target too young and too under-resourced to mount any meaningful resistance. It does not go as planned. The prototypes in question, it turns out, are rigged with defensive countermeasures this teenage inventor built entirely from salvaged and repurposed materials, calibrated with a precision that costs Latverian agents both the acquisition and, more painfully for Doom's pride, 2 full months of subsequent technical analysis simply trying to understand how a system built from scrap had outperformed hardware Latveria's own well-funded engineers had spent years refining. Doom's private reaction to this failure, recorded in a file his own advisors describe as unusually terse even by his standards, contains a single line that this story returns to now because it echoes almost exactly a sentence from its very first chapters. The resources were beneath consideration. The mind behind them was not. It was not true, or rather, it had never been true in any of the versions of this rivalry this story has traced. The dismissal of resources as a meaningful signal of a mind's worth, made now for perhaps the 4th or 5th time across this long history, by a man whose entire early life had been defined by exactly the kind of resourcefulness he kept mistaking, in others, for something lesser. The turning point of this particular trial arrives during a period of genuine crisis. A moment when this young inventor, still finding her footing in a mantle she had not been formally handed so much as claimed for herself out of necessity, finds herself facing a threat that outmatches her current resources by a significant margin, a threat that, through circumstances neither side fully anticipated, briefly aligns her interests with Doom's own. It is not an alliance either side is comfortable naming as such. But for a period of days, Doom's forces and this young inventor's improvised defenses operate out of pure tactical necessity, on the same side of a conflict neither of them chose. What Doom witnesses during those days unsettles him more than any prior trial in this story quite manages to, because it does not merely repeat the pattern he has already grudgingly come to expect from every prior Stark he has faced. The willingness to pay a personal cost, the discipline to correct course honestly, the stubborn refusal to let ambition outrun conscience. It exceeds it. He watches a mind younger than any he has faced across this entire rivalry solve, in real time, under genuine pressure, a resource allocation problem that Doom's own far better funded engineering corps had spent weeks failing to resolve, not through more advanced theory, but through a kind of improvisational resourcefulness that Doom recognizes, with a discomfort he never fully articulates to anyone as something close to a purer, less compromised version of the very trait that first made him who he is. He does not say this to her directly. He would not know how, even if some part of him wanted to, which the historical record leaves genuinely ambiguous. What he does instead, in the aftermath of that brief shared crisis, is something this story has by now learned to recognize as his particular backhanded register of respect. He leaves her alone. Not out of mercy exactly, and not out of any newly discovered fondness. Doom does not soften easily, and this story has never claimed otherwise, but out of something closer to a private, unspoken recognition that this particular rival did not need his contempt to keep growing into whatever she was eventually going to become, and that his contempt, if anything, would only slow a process he had, somewhere in those shared days of crisis, begun rooting for despite himself. Say the reframe once more, in the form this trial earns. It was not that Doom finally learned to respect resourcefulness born of necessity, the exact quality he had once watched his own father humiliated for lacking the title to fully deploy. It was that, faced with a mirror young enough and unguarded enough to make the resemblance impossible to keep denying, he found himself for the first time in this long story rooting for a rival to succeed. Not because he had been defeated into admiration, but because some old, buried, rarely acknowledged part of him recognized in her the boy he had once been, before the mask, before the crown, before he decided that being feared mattered more than being understood. It is the closest this entire story comes to Doom extending something like generosity without being forced into it by circumstance. It does not last in any sustained way. This story has never once claimed that Victor Von Doom's growth across any of these trials arrives in a straight line or holds without relapse. But it happened. The record shows it happened. And it happened for reasons that had very little to do with the armor at all and everything to do with a resemblance Doom spent most of his life trying very hard not to see. Chapter 8. C. The Trial of the Reality that Called Itself Ordinary. There is a version of this rivalry set in a reality its own inhabitants have, at various points, taken to calling with a certain dry, self-aware humor that Doom himself has never once appreciated, the ordinary one, as though the differences separating it from every other timeline this story has visited were a matter of degree rather than kind. It is not, in any meaningful sense, ordinary. But it is perhaps the version of this rivalry where both men's public faces are most fully formed, most widely recognized, most thoroughly documented by a global audience that watched, in something close to real time, the long, slow arc of who each of them would eventually become. In this reality, Tony Stark's transformation from arms manufacturer to armored protector happens publicly, almost immediately, in a way that leaves very little room for the kind of quiet, private reassessment this story has traced in other timelines. The world knows who he is almost from the beginning. It knows too, in broad outline, the mistakes that follow, the technology that slips loose of his control, the alliances built and broken, the long public reckoning with a legacy he never fully stops trying to atone for. Doom's intelligence on this version of Stark is, as a result, unusually thorough, drawn not from painstaking private surveillance, but from an ocean of public record that any sufficiently motivated observer could, in principle, access for themselves. And it is precisely this abundance of public information that leads Doom, in this particular trial, into his most consequential misjudgment of the entire rivalry. Not a misjudgment of capability, which he has, by this point across the many versions of this story, mostly learned to respect, but a misjudgment of pattern. Watching this Stark's public failures accumulate across years of documented crisis, a fractured alliance among his fellow protectors, a series of technological interventions that cause more harm than the threats they were built to prevent, a period of public disgrace so thorough that even casual observers outside any intelligence apparatus could track its contours from ordinary news coverage. Doom concludes, with the particular flat certainty that has defined every chapter of this story where he has eventually been proven wrong, that this version of his rival has finally, permanently exhausted whatever resilience carried him through the earlier trials this story has already described. He has run out of second chances, Doom tells his War Council, in an assessment later recovered and widely studied by historians of this particular timeline precisely because of how spectacularly it fails to anticipate what follows. A man cannot rebuild himself indefinitely. Eventually the well runs dry, and what remains is simply wreckage wearing very expensive armor. It was not true. It had never been true in any version of this story, and this particular trial exists in large part to demonstrate exactly why a pattern that has held across every single prior confrontation this essay has traced does not simply stop holding because the failures happen to be more publicly visible than usual. Doom moves against this weakened, publicly disgraced version of Stark with what he considers, at the time, an almost unnecessary abundance of caution, a slow, methodical campaign designed to fracture what remains of his rival's already fractured alliances beyond any hope of repair, executed with the patient confidence of a man who believes he is finishing a job reality has already mostly completed for him. And for a period of real, sustained months, the campaign works exactly as designed. Old allies, exhausted by years of accumulated crisis, decline to answer Stark's calls. Institutional support, worn thin by scandal after scandal, quietly withdraws. By any conventional measure available to Doom's intelligence apparatus, this version of Tony Stark enters the culminating confrontation of this particular trial more isolated, more publicly diminished, more thoroughly stripped of the resources that carried him through every earlier version of this rivalry than at any other point in this entire long story. And it is precisely this isolation this story finally reveals that Doom's model fails once again to correctly interpret. Because what Doom's intelligence, thorough as it is regarding public record, and thin as it remains, as it has remained across nearly every trial in this story, regarding the private interior of the man himself, consistently fails to track is the specific, quiet, unglamorous work Stark does during every one of those isolated months. Not the public rebuilding, which the record shows clearly, and which Doom's own analysts dismiss characteristically as theatre. The private work, the unwitnessed hours spent alone, correcting the specific technical failures that caused the earlier crises. The unrecorded conversations, one at a time, in which a man with far less public capital left to spend than in any earlier chapter of this rivalry, rebuilds trust not through grand gesture, but through the same slow, patient, individually costly honesty this story has traced since its very first chapters, back to a killed weapon, back to a stolen technology met with a cure instead of retaliation, back to an armor worn quietly, without permission, in a workshop no one else was watching. By the time Doom's forces move against what he believes to be an isolated, exhausted target, they discover instead a resistance rebuilt not on the scale of the alliances that had failed him, but on something smaller and, in this particular confrontation, considerably more durable. A handful of relationships repaired one at a time at real personal cost in the quiet months no intelligence file had thought to track closely enough. The confrontation that follows is not the route Doom's models had predicted. It is closer, in the language this story has used before, to a correction. Not a dramatic reversal so much as a slow, grinding demonstration that the specific quality Doom kept mistaking for exhaustion was, in fact, its precise opposite. A capacity for renewal that did not depend on public support at all, that had, across every version of this rivalry this story has traced, never actually depended on it, however much it might have looked that way from the outside, from a war room, from a file built entirely out of public record and private contempt. Doom's forces withdraw, not defeated outright, but denied the decisive victory the campaign had been built to achieve, and in the aftermath, reviewing the failure with the same unflinching, uncomfortable honesty that has, by this late point in the story, become one of the few genuinely admirable threads running through his otherwise deeply flawed character, Doom arrives at an assessment that this story offers here nearly in full, because it may be the clearest single statement of the entire rivalry's central irony that the historical record preserves. I have spent this entire history measuring him by what the world could see him lose, the assessment reads, and I have never once adequately accounted for what he rebuilds in the spaces no one, including me, was watching closely enough to track. This is not a flaw in my intelligence, it is a flaw in what intelligence, however thorough, is capable of seeing at all. It is, of every private admission this story has quoted from Doom across every trial and every reality, perhaps the most genuinely humble, and it arrives, characteristically, far too late to prevent the failure that finally forced him to write it. But it survives, in Latverian archives that Doom himself, for reasons no later historian has ever fully explained, chose never to have sealed or destroyed, as though some part of him wanted this particular lesson to remain legible, even to a rival, even to history, even to himself on some future evening when he might need reminding of it again. Let the story rest here, one final time, before it turns toward the war that follows. There is a particular quality to silence after a failed campaign. Not the sharp, immediate silence of a battle's end, but something slower, more diffuse. The silence of an army withdrawing through hills that do not care one way or another who has won, under a sky already indifferent to the whole affair, gathering itself toward whatever comes next. Chapter 9. A. The sources gathered quietly before the war. Before the war that very nearly ends this rivalry outright, it is worth pausing one more time on the sources this story has leaned on to reconstruct a history that neither of its two central figures was ever especially eager to have fully documented. Much of what this essay has drawn on comes, as it has noted along the way, from Latverian state archives, records Doom himself, for reasons this story has already speculated about gently and will not overstate now, chose never to have sealed as thoroughly as the rest of his kingdom's classified history. Supplementary detail comes from Stark Industries' own internal communications, portions of which entered the public record during the various periods of institutional scrutiny this story has referenced across earlier chapters. The licensing disputes, the technology transfer restrictions, the long, slow accumulation of small bureaucratic frictions that first alerted Doom all those years ago, to the fact that his toymaker rival had been quietly reshaping the terms of their engagement without ever needing to raise his voice to do it. Independent confirmation, where this story has been able to find it, comes from third-party accounts. The retired Latvian minister's memoir cited earlier, whose careful, cautious prose captures better than any official record the particular texture of watching a king change without ever admitting he had. The handful of allies present during the forced alliance, whose matching recollections of a single quiet sentence, "Trust me," gave this essay one of its clearest windows into a relationship that resisted, at nearly every turn, being fully explained by either of the men living inside it. Where the record runs thin, and it does run thin in places, particularly regarding the private interior of a man as guarded as Victor von Doom, this story has tried to be honest about the difference between what the documentation actually shows and what this telling has, gently, respectfully, inferred from the shape of everything surrounding it. The small, unmarked chamber in the depths of Doom's castle, the particular quiet of a workshop late at night, dust drifting through a single working lamp, while a king who had spent his whole life despising toymakers quietly became one. These are not claims this story makes with the same confidence it brings to a documented battle, a recovered file, a directly quoted sentence. They are offered instead the way this whole long telling has offered its quietest moments throughout. Not as certainty, but as the truest shape the available evidence seems to be pointing toward, when you step back far enough to see the whole long pattern of it, and let the pattern rather than any single dramatic proof do the convincing. It is worth naming this plainly here, near the story's end, because a history built entirely out of certainties would be, in its own way, a betrayal of everything this particular rivalry actually teaches. Doom's great and repeated failure across every trial this story has traced was mistaking his own certainty for a complete accounting of the truth. It would be a strange kind of irony, and not the intentional kind, for a story built to disprove that exact habit of mind to end up modelling it in its own method of telling. So let this stand, plainly, before the story turns toward its largest and most consequential confrontation. Everything that follows is reconstructed as faithfully as the available record allows, offered with appropriate humility about the places where certainty simply is not available, and trusted the way this whole long rivalry eventually taught even its most stubborn participant to trust, at least a little, at least when it mattered, carefully, and only after the evidence had earned it. From here, let the pacing begin its slow descent. The story is not finished. There is still a war to fight, and a stranger reckoning after it, but the rhythm should start to loosen now, the sentences beginning to stretch and settle the way a held muscle finally releases after a long day. Let the questions grow rarer, let the quiet stretches grow longer. This is where the essay stops trying to keep you awake and starts gently giving you permission to drift. Chapter 9. The War That Looked Like an Ending. There is a version of this rivalry, the one most often cited when people try to summarize the whole strange history of Doom and Stark in a single sentence for a documentary or a classroom or a late-night conversation between friends who have had one drink too many to still be arguing about comic book physics, that culminates not in a quiet moment of recognition, but in an actual, full, catastrophic war fought on Doom's own terms, on Doom's own soil, with a decisiveness that very nearly gives him the victory his entire self-image had always insisted was inevitable. It happens, in mainstream continuity, during a period of global instability that Doom, characteristically, does not create so much as recognize and seize, a moment when trust in institutions has frayed, when Stark's own standing among former allies has been weakened by years of accumulated mistakes. Some of them the very mistakes this story has already traced, back to the arc reactor, back to the choices made in fear rather than clarity. Doom watches this weakening the way a surgeon watches a wound that has finally, after long infection, begun to show where the real damage lives. He does not attack Stark directly. That would be too simple, and by this point in the rivalry, Victor von Doom has learned, however grudgingly, however incompletely, that simple attacks against this particular rival tend to fail in ways his models cannot always predict. Instead, he moves against the coalition Stark has spent years building, isolating him from allies one careful diplomatic maneuver at a time, until the day finally comes when Doom's forces move against a Stark operating with fewer resources, fewer friends, and less institutional trust than at almost any other point in this long and tangled history. The battle that follows, chroniclers differ on exactly how long it lasts, with some accounts compressing it into a single devastating night and others stretching it across the better part of a week of running engagements across 3 continents, is, by any fair accounting, Doom's finest tactical performance against this rival. He anticipates Stark's improvisations before they happen, having studied them now across years and multiple versions of the man. He commits reserves precisely when Stark's forces are most overextended. He achieves, for the first time in this entire story, something that looks, to every outside observer, indistinguishable from total victory. Stark's primary command center falls. His closest allies are scattered or captured. And in the final hours of the engagement, Doom himself stands, for the first time in years, over a version of Tony Stark whose armor lies dark and depleted at his feet, the man inside it conscious, exhausted, and, by every metric Doom has ever used to measure an opponent, defeated. This is the false peak. Sit with it for a moment before the story moves past it, because false peaks deserve to be recognized honestly, without the comfort of already knowing how the larger story resolves. Doom does not kill him. This detail matters more than almost anything else in the entire history of this rivalry, and it is worth turning over slowly, the way you might turn over a stone you found on a long walk, curious about what made it the shape it is. Doom has killed rivals before. He has killed with less provocation and with less to gain from restraint than he has here, standing over a man who represents the single most consistent obstacle to nearly every ambition Doom has held for decades. Every incentive available to him in that moment argues for finishing what the battle has already, by any reasonable measure, decided. He does not do it, and the reason he gives, recorded unusually for Doom, not in a private file meant only for his own later reference but spoken aloud to Stark himself in the ruined command center, in a voice his own advisors would later describe as quieter than they had ever heard him, is a reason that this story has been building towards since its very first chapter, without ever quite letting Doom say it plainly until now. "You are the only rival I have ever had," Doom tells him, in that quiet, ruined room, who was worth the trouble of watching lose. "Killing you would end that. I find, against my own expectation, that I am not yet prepared to end it." It was not mercy, not exactly, and it would be a mistake to read it as some late redemption arc compressed into a single sentence. Victor Von Doom does not become a merciful man in that room. He remains, in every way that matters, the same king who overthrew a government before he was old enough in some tellings to legally do so. The same sorcerer who has bent time and argued with gods and rewritten his own history, rather than admit fault. But something in that sentence is true in a way almost nothing else Doom has said across this entire rivalry has been true, and the truth of it is this: somewhere across all those trials, the ultimate war he barely won, the Extremis theft that cost him more than it gained, the superior era that nearly convinced him he'd been right all along before proving the opposite, the son who found his father's old files and chose, against every incentive, to honor them. Victor Von Doom had stopped seeing Tony Stark as an inconvenience to be cleared from his path. He had started, without ever admitting it to himself in so many words, to need him, not as a friend. Doom does not have those, not really, not in any sense that would survive close examination, but as a mirror, as the one reflection in his entire long and glittering and violent existence that refused to simply agree with him, refused to simply fear him, refused, across every single encounter this story has traced, to become either a servant or a corpse. It was not victory. It only looked like victory for one long night to everyone watching from outside. From inside that ruined room, it was something closer to a question Doom did not yet have language for, and would not find the language for until much later, under circumstances stranger than anything either man could have predicted on that particular battlefield. Let the story rest here briefly in the quiet after that unfinished ending. Somewhere in the wreckage of that command center, rain has begun again, it seems in this telling, to rain rather often over the parts of this story that matter most, and there is no need to explain why. Some things simply arrive when a story needs them to. A single emergency light flickers somewhere down a corridor lined with scorched consoles, throwing long, unsteady shadows that move slower than shadows usually do, as if even the light in that room understood that something significant, something neither man could name yet, had just finished happening. Dust, disturbed by the battle, drifts slowly down through a shaft of grey morning light that has begun, almost apologetically, to find its way through a shattered section of ceiling. Somewhere outside, the sounds of a city beginning, cautiously, to believe the fighting is over. Inside, only two men and a silence that neither of them, for once, seems eager to break. This is where the trial ends. Not with a killing blow, not with a rescue arriving in the final possible moment, dramatic and triumphant. Just two exhausted men, and a sentence spoken quietly enough that history very nearly failed to record it at all. Chapter 10. The cost no one else saw. It would be a comforting shape for this story to take if the false peak resolved cleanly into friendship from here, the two rivals finding, in that ruined command center, some mutual respect that simplified everything that followed. That is not what happens, and this essay, built as it is to soothe you towards sleep rather than to lie to you, will not pretend otherwise. What happens instead is smaller and slower and in its own way sadder than a clean reconciliation would have been. Stark recovers. Of course he recovers. Every version of this man in every version of this story recovers eventually from defeats that would have ended lesser rivals for good. He rebuilds his coalition more carefully this time, having learned, as he has learned from every prior mistake this story has traced, back to the arc reactor, back to the weapons he once built without asking who they would eventually be used against, exactly which alliances had been built on convenience rather than genuine trust. Doom, for his part, returns to Latveria having won, by any conventional measure, the largest and most decisive engagement of this entire long rivalry, and yet finds himself, in the weeks that follow, unable to fully enjoy the victory the way every previous triumph of his reign has been enjoyed. His advisors notice it before they understand it. A king who has always announced his victories with theatre, with proclamations, with the kind of grand public certainty that has defined every chapter of his rule, says almost nothing about this one. The file on Stark, updated as always in the immediate aftermath of any major engagement, receives only a single new line, written in Doom's own hand, rather than dictated to a scribe, which is itself unusual enough that the aide who eventually archives it makes a private note of the anomaly. The line reads, "Victory achieved. Question remains unresolved." No one in Doom's court then, or for years afterward, ever fully learns what question he meant. This story will offer, gently, without insisting on certainty it cannot fully claim, one possible answer, that somewhere in that ruined command center, standing over a defeated rival, he had every reason and every opportunity to finally, permanently remove from his life. Victor von Doom had discovered that the fight itself, not the winning of it, but the ongoing, unresolved, endlessly renewing fact of having a worthy opponent at all, had become something he needed in a way he had never allowed himself to need anything else. Not power, not the crown, not even Latveria itself, which he would in other tellings. In other trials, this story has not had room to cover, burn to the ground and rebuild rather than lose. He needed, it turns out, to keep being wrong about Tony Stark, because being wrong about him was the only proof Doom had left, in a life built almost entirely around never being wrong about anything, that the world still contained something he had not yet fully mapped, fully conquered, fully understood. It was not friendship. It would be dishonest and a disservice to both men to call it that. But it was not enmity either, not purely, not any longer. It had become something rarer and stranger than either word can quite hold. The particular, specific respect that only exists between two people who have each, independently and repeatedly, refused to let the other one win the argument about who the other one really is. Say the central irony now, for the third time, in words different from the first two. Doom mocked Stark for building solutions that cost him something personal rather than solutions that simply worked. And it was that exact willingness to pay a personal cost again and again across every version of the man this story has traced that Doom, across decades and realities, could never quite find a way to defeat. Chapter 10. The Advisors Who Watched Him Choose Not to Kill. There is one more account worth including here, gathered from a source this story has not yet quoted directly before the essay moves into the strangest and quietest chapter of the entire rivalry. Among the handful of Latverian officers present in the ruined command center on the night Doom chose not to finish what the battle had already, by every conventional measure, decided, only one ever spoke publicly, and only once, decades later, in a recorded interview conducted for a historical archive whose existence Latveria's later government neither confirmed nor denied. He was young that night, barely more than an aide, present mostly to relay logistical updates rather than to participate in anything resembling the strategic decisions being made around him. What he remembers, he says, is not the battle itself, which he describes in the flat procedural language of a man trained to report facts rather than feelings. What he remembers is the quiet that followed it. We expected an execution, he says. In the recording this story draws from here. Every one of us in that room had served long enough to know what a completed victory looked like under His Majesty's command. There was a protocol for it, unspoken but absolute. And when the moment came and passed and nothing happened, when he simply stood there, over a rival every strategic logic available to us said he should have ended, none of us understood what we were watching. We did not have the language for it. Some of us, I think, were even a little afraid, in a way we had never been afraid of him before. Not because he seemed weaker, because he seemed, for the only time in my years of service, uncertain. And a king who has never once been uncertain, choosing, in the one moment that mattered most, to become uncertain in front of his own officers, that is a stranger thing to witness than any battle I have ever stood through. This account matters here at this late point in the story, not because it changes anything about what actually happened in that ruined command center. This essay has already described the moment itself, and the sentence Doom spoke as clearly as the record allows. It matters because it offers something the earlier telling could not, a witness's raw, unprocessed sense of how strange, how genuinely unprecedented that single choice appeared to the people who knew this particular king best, who had spent years learning to predict him with a precision that made this one deviation feel, to them, less like an isolated exception and more like the first visible crack in a foundation none of them had ever expected to see move. It did not collapse. This story has been careful throughout not to overstate the transformation it traces. Doom remains, across every subsequent chapter, recognizably himself. Capable of cruelty, this essay has not shied away from describing, committed to an authoritarian vision of order that no amount of grudging respect for one particular rival ever meaningfully softened. But the crack, once visible, never fully closed again either, and it is worth letting that officer's testimony stand here, unadorned, as the story turns now toward its final and strangest chapter. The season when the world believed the man in the armor gone, and a king who had built his entire existence around never once being uncertain chose, quietly, without an audience, to sit inside that uncertainty a while longer than protocol or pride, or the whole long architecture of his own self-image had ever previously allowed. Let the sentences slow further here. This is the deepest part of the story, and it should feel, from this point forward, less like something being told to you, and more like something settling over you, the way a heavy blanket settles, without needing you to notice the exact moment it finished arriving. Chapter 11. The Day the World Believed Tony Stark Was Dead. Every long rivalry, if it runs long enough, eventually arrives at the one twist that no earlier chapter could have prepared you for, because it does not follow from strength or cunning or victory at all. It follows from loss. And the deepest, strangest chapter in the entire history between Victor Von Doom and every version of the man in the Iron Man armor begins not with Doom triumphant and not with Stark triumphant, but with the world believing, for a period long enough to matter, that Tony Stark was simply gone. The circumstances that lead to this belief are, in mainstream continuity, tangled and painful in ways this story will describe only as gently as the truth allows. A conflict among heroes who had once trusted each other completely, fractured by a predictive technology that claimed to know, before the fact, who among them would eventually turn against the world they were sworn to protect. Stark, believing in the technology's promise even as it cost him allies, even as it cost him relationships, This story has already traced across years of careful, hard-won trust, pursues its logic to a conclusion that leaves him, in the technology's own tangled unfolding, gravely injured badly enough and publicly enough that the machinery of grief begins turning before anyone can be entirely certain grief is warranted. It is, in its way, the least dramatic ending imaginable for a man who spent his whole adult life building increasingly elaborate machines to survive increasingly elaborate threats. Not a final battle. Not a last stand against Doom or any other rival this story has named. Just a body badly hurt in a hospital bed and a world outside that bed slowly, painfully beginning to accept the possibility that the man behind the armor might not be coming back. Word reaches Latveria the way important word always eventually reaches Latveria, quickly through channels Doom has spent decades cultivating specifically so that he is never the last man in the world to know something that matters. He receives the report in the same high tower where, years earlier, he had first read a memo stamped with 6 dismissive letters and felt, for the first time, the ground of his own certainty shift beneath him. This time, there is no aide present to witness his reaction. This story, built as it is on records and reconstructions, and the occasional necessary act of informed imagination where the historical record simply does not reach, will not pretend to know exactly what passed across Victor Von Doom's face in that private moment. What the record does show, clearly, is what he does in the days that follow, and it is unlike anything he has done in any prior chapter of this long rivalry. He does not celebrate. He does not move against Stark's grieving allies while they are weakened, though every tactical instinct that has defined his entire reign would counsel exactly that. He does not even, for a period of weeks that his own advisors find increasingly difficult to explain to a court accustomed to a king who never hesitates, issue any public statement at all. He goes instead quietly, without ceremony, without announcement, into the wreckage of a laboratory he has visited only in memory and in intelligence files for years, a place connected to the technology that caused Stark's injury, a place Doom's engineers have quietly, patiently mapped for longer than anyone outside his innermost circle knew. And there, alone, working with his own hands in a way he has not done since the earliest years of his reign, before there were armies and advisors and a kingdom to manage, Victor Von Doom begins trying to save the life of the man he has spent decades refusing to call his equal. It was not mercy, not exactly, though it looked to the handful of people who eventually learned of it exactly like mercy from the outside. This story will not pretend to fully resolve in a single clean sentence what it actually was. Perhaps it is closer to the truth to say this. A man who had built his entire existence around never losing an argument discovered, in that quiet laboratory, that he was not prepared to lose this particular argument by forfeit. Stark's death would end the rivalry permanently, without a final answer to the question that had haunted Doom's private files for years. And Victor Von Doom, whatever else can be said of him across every chapter of this long and complicated history, has never once been able to tolerate an unanswered question, especially not one this close to the center of who he believed himself to be. Chapter 12. The armor he never expected to wear. What follows next is the strangest single chapter in the entire history of this rivalry, and it deserves to be told slowly because it happened slowly. Not as a single dramatic reveal, but as a long, quiet, private transformation that the wider world would not fully understand until long after it had already taken shape. Working from data he has gathered across years of study, the intelligence files, the recovered technology, the countless hours spent across every trial this story has already described, trying to understand a rival he could never quite predict, Victor Von Doom begins to build something he has never built before. Not a weapon aimed at Stark, not armor meant to defeat the Iron Man suit in battle. An extension of Stark's own unfinished work, continued in Stark's own absence, guided by notes and schematics and half-completed research that Doom, alone among Stark's rivals, understood well enough to carry forward. He does not do this publicly. He does not announce it, does not frame it as tribute, does not perform grief the way a lesser man, a man still primarily concerned with how his actions would be read by history, might have been tempted to. He does it in the same quiet, private register that has defined every genuine moment of connection this story has traced between these two men. The 11 days no one watched, the report no one but an aide saw, the sentence spoken in a ruined command center that history very nearly failed to record. And then, in a moment that even Doom's closest advisors describe years later as the single strangest thing they ever witnessed him do, Victor Von Doom puts on a version of the Iron Man armor. Not his own design, layered over stolen schematics the way he had approached Extremis years earlier. A genuine continuation, refined, altered, made unmistakably his own in the details, but built unmistakably in the lineage of the very technology he had spent decades publicly dismissing as beneath him. He takes up, in Stark's presumed absence, the exact mantle he had spent this entire story insisting was the work of a toymaker, an amateur, a rich man playing soldier. It was not conquest. This matters enormously, and the story will slow here to make sure it lands the way it should. Doom does not take the armor to prove he could have built it better all along, though there are certainly moments recorded in his own private notes from this period where some old familiar arrogance briefly resurfaces. He takes it, more than anything else, to continue something he had come, across years of watching this man he refused to call a friend, to believe was worth continuing. He uses it not to expand Latveria's borders, not to settle old scores with Stark's allies, but, in the specific, careful, well-documented actions of this period, to do work that reads unmistakably like the work Stark himself would have done had he been able to. He protects people who never knew his real face was underneath the mask. He solves problems the old Iron Man technology had left unfinished. He operates, for a period that stretches longer than anyone watching from outside Latveria's borders would have believed him capable of, not as a king expanding his empire, but as something closer, however uncomfortably the word sits on him, to a steward, carrying forward a legacy that was never his to carry, because the man whose legacy it was could no longer carry it himself. Say the central irony one final time, in its clearest and most complete form, because this is the chapter that proves it beyond any argument the rest of the story could offer. The quality Doom mocked most consistently in Stark, the willingness to keep rebuilding imperfectly at personal cost rather than simply declaring victory and moving on, became, in this chapter, the exact quality Doom himself finally had to practice, alone, without an audience, without a crown to make it easier in a laboratory no one was watching. It was not that Doom became Stark, he remained in every important way entirely himself, the same pride, the same certainty, the same capacity for cruelty that this story has never once tried to soften or explain away. But for a period of real, sustained, documented time, Victor Von Doom did the one thing his entire prior existence had insisted he would never do. He set aside the crown and picked up someone else's unfinished work, and did it not for power, not for spectacle, but simply because the work mattered and because the man who had started it could no longer finish it himself. Let the story rest here again, gently, the way it has learned to rest in the quiet spaces between its loudest moments. Picture, if it helps, the particular quality of light in a workshop very late at night, not the high tower of Latveria's castle this time, but something smaller, more private, more like the labs this story described at its very beginning, dust drifting slow through a single working lamp. The low hum of machinery that has been running so long it has become a kind of silence in its own right. Somewhere outside that workshop, a world that believes Tony Stark is gone continues, unaware that the technology quietly protecting parts of it in this period carries underneath an unfamiliar signature, the exact, careful, patient logic of a man learning, very late and very privately, what it actually costs to build something worth trusting. This is not the ending. There is a return still to come, a reckoning between two men who will eventually have to look at each other again and account for what happened in the space where one of them was presumed gone. But for now, in this quiet middle distance of the story's deepest chapter, let it simply be what it is. Two men, one absent and one wearing his mantle without his permission, connected across a silence neither of them chose, doing each in his own way the same slow and patient work. Chapter 13. What Stark Found When He Returned. Tony Stark, in every version of this story where the record survives clearly enough to trace, does eventually return. This story will not dwell long on the mechanism of his recovery. The medical and technological details vary depending on which telling you consult, and none of them matter as much as what happens after, which is the only part of this chapter this essay is truly interested in. What Stark finds, upon returning to a world that had spent months believing him gone, is not simply grief transformed into relief, though there is plenty of that, recorded in the accounts of allies who had, by every reasonable measure, already begun the slow work of letting him go. What he finds, once the dust of his own return has settled enough for him to start asking careful questions about what had happened in his absence, is a set of actions. Quiet, careful, unmistakably competent, bearing the unmistakable fingerprints of continued work on his own unfinished research that he cannot, at first, explain. It takes him longer than it should, by his own later admission, to arrive at the answer because the answer is simply too strange to reach for first. When he finally does reach it, when the pattern of the work, the specific choices, the particular blend of technical refinement, and something almost like restraint finally resolves, in his mind, into a single name. The reaction recorded by those close to him in that period is not fury, though fury would have been by any reasonable measure, the expected response to discovering that his oldest and most persistent rival had spent months quietly wearing his face. It is something closer to a long, careful silence, followed by a question he asks not of his allies, but privately to himself, in terms one close associate later recalled almost word for word. Why would he do that? What does Doom get out of finishing something that isn't his? This story does not know, with certainty, whether Stark ever received a satisfying answer to that question directly from Doom himself. The historical record on their eventual reunion is, characteristically for both men, guarded. Neither one has ever fully explained on the record what passed between them when they finally stood in the same room again, both aware of what the other had done in the space between. What the record does show, clearly, and what matters most for the purposes of this story, is this. The confrontation that every prior chapter of this rivalry would have predicted. Recrimination, fury, a battle fought over stolen identity and violated trust, never fully materializes. What happens instead is smaller and stranger, and in its own quiet way, the truest resolution this long and tangled rivalry could have offered. Stark, reviewing the specific choices Doom made while wearing his mantle, who was protected, what was fixed, what was, notably, never once used for Latverian gain despite every opportunity to do so, arrives, slowly, at a conclusion he does not share widely, but that he does, according to one surviving account, say quietly to a single trusted ally. He did it right. I don't understand why, but he did it right. It was not forgiveness, not fully, not in any way either man would ever describe using that word, but it was something this story has been circling since its very first chapter, without either man ever having the language or perhaps the willingness to name it plainly until this exact moment. Recognition. Total, complete, uncomfortable recognition, finally arriving after decades of dismissal, theft, war, and one long quiet season in a workshop where a king who despised toymakers had, alone, without an audience, become one. Chapter 13. A. What the court whispered and never to his face. There is a particular kind of history that never makes it into any official record, and it survives, when it survives at all, only in the quiet, half-embarrassed recollections of people who spent their careers standing just outside a great and terrible man's direct line of sight, close enough to watch him change, far too cautious of their own necks to ever say so where he could hear it. Latveria's court, across the many decades this long rivalry spans, keeps no formal chronicle of Victor von Doom's private evolution regarding the man in the Iron Man armor. Such a chronicle would have been, by any reasonable estimate, a matter of considerable danger to compile, let alone to circulate, and yet something like it exists anyway, scattered across the private letters, the retirement memoirs, the occasional careful interview granted decades later by advisors who had by then outlived the immediate consequences of candor. Piece these fragments together, patiently, the way this story has tried to do across every chapter that came before this one, and a portrait emerges that Doom himself, this story suspects, would never have permitted to be assembled while he still held the power to prevent it. One retired minister, in a memoir published only after both his own death and, by pure accident of timing, several years after the events described in the previous chapter, recalls the specific season when the shift became impossible for the inner court to ignore any longer. He does not name it precisely. The record is characteristically imprecise about exactly which trial, which war, which quiet, unwatched season finally tipped the balance. But he describes, in language this story finds worth preserving nearly whole, the particular texture of a king who had, for as long as anyone in that court could remember, treated every rival as either a tool to be used or an obstacle to be removed, beginning, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to treat one specific rival as something else entirely. "We did not have a word for it," the minister writes, "because His Majesty would never have permitted us the word, had we found one. He did not soften. Let no one who reads this account mistake what I am describing for softening. I served him for 30 years, and I promise you the man who dismissed a dissenting general with a single cold sentence in his 41st year on the throne was, in every essential way, the same man who did so in his 71st. But there was a name he stopped saying the way he said every other name. Every rival, every enemy, every fool who crossed him. These he spoke of with contempt so total it barely required emphasis, the way a man does not raise his voice to describe the weather. This one name over the years he began saying differently, quieter, as though weighing it each time before he let it leave his mouth. We noticed. None of us, of course, was foolish enough to remark on it, but we noticed. It is a small detail, easy to pass over, and this story lingers on it here precisely because it is small, because the largest truths about long, complicated relationships are so often carried not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in exactly this kind of quiet, cumulative, barely perceptible shift in how a name gets said across enough years that even the people paid to stay silent about it eventually can't help noticing. Another account, this one gathered secondhand through a historian who interviewed several former Latvian officials decades after their service had ended, describes a smaller, stranger detail still, a private chamber in the depths of Doom's castle, accessible to almost no one, where, according to two separate officials who claim independently of one another to have glimpsed it only once, under circumstances neither was ever willing to fully specify, an old, damaged piece of Iron Man technology sat, for years, displayed not as a trophy, mounted the way Doom displayed the wreckage of every other defeated rival's equipment throughout his halls, but set apart, alone, in a room with no other trophies in it at all. Neither official could say, with any confidence, what the room actually meant to him. This story will not pretend to know either. It offers the detail only the way this whole long telling has offered its quietest, least certain moments. Not as settled fact, but as the shape the available evidence seems, gently, insistently, to be pointing toward. What is certain, because the public record confirms it far more directly than any second-hand court memoir could, is this. Across the final chapters of this rivalry, in every reality this story has visited, Doom's confrontations with the man in the Iron Man armor grow steadily less frequent and steadily less lethal in their intent, even as his other wars against other rivals, other rebellions, other inconveniences to his rule, continue with undiminished severity. He never explains the change. He is not, this story has been careful to note throughout, a man given to explaining himself to anyone, for any reason, and this final chapter of his long evolution is no exception. But the pattern holds, across decades, across timelines, with a consistency that eventually becomes its own kind of evidence. A king who has never once in his long and violent existence shown mercy without a reason he was willing to state plainly, out loud, for the historical record, spends the final long stretch of this particular rivalry extending something that functions in every observable respect exactly like mercy. Quietly, without explanation, without ever once calling it by that name. Let the story settle here, one more time, in this last long quiet passage before it turns finally toward its ending. Picture, if it helps you towards sleep, that small unmarked chamber the two officials each claim to have glimpsed only once. Not as a place of grief exactly, and not quite a shrine, but something in between, the way certain rooms in certain old houses come to hold, without any deliberate decision on anyone's part. The weight of a whole relationship that never found the right words to explain itself while both people involved were still speaking to each other. A single window, high and narrow, the kind built for defense rather than for light. Whatever weather is happening outside, and by now this story has made its preference for rain fairly clear, so let it be raining here too, softly, unhurried, the way rain falls over old stone when there is no one left awake to watch it, finds its way in only faintly. A grey wash of light across a floor no servant has been permitted to clean in longer than anyone currently living in that castle can say for certain. Somewhere beneath that floor, the rest of the castle goes on being what it has always been, a seat of absolute power, a throne room, a war council chamber, all the loud, certain architecture of a man who has spent his whole life insisting he needs nothing and no one. And here, in this one small, unremarked room, something else entirely, folded quietly into the walls, asking nothing of anyone, least of all of the king who built it and never once explained why. Chapter 17, every version counted slowly, one more time. It is worth pausing here, near the very end, and simply counting them, not quickly, not as a list to rush past on the way to a conclusion, but slowly, the way you might count the lit windows of a house from the street outside on a cold evening, each one its own small, warm fact worth noticing individually before you finally look away. There was the ultimate reality, where a younger, more reckless version of the man in the armor adapted faster in the middle of a battle than any intelligence file had prepared his opponent to expect, and where the word amateur, once spoken with such total confidence, quietly stopped appearing in a king's private files, replaced by something colder and far more respectful: variable. There was the reality of Extremis, where a stolen technology, meant to hand one rival an advantage over another, instead handed him a mirror he did not want and could not look away from, a demonstration that belief, unlike obedience, cannot be commanded into existence no matter how absolute the crown that tries to command it. There was the superior season, stranger than either of those, where the man Doom expected to finally agree with him instead spent months teaching him, without ever intending it as a lesson, the difference between a crown and a lock, between total control seized because it can be seized, and the harder, costlier, far less certain work of building something that people choose to trust rather than something they are simply forced to obey. There was the son, raised apart, who found in his dead father's old, unglamorous, unremarked files a version of the man history had never bothered writing down, a father who killed a working weapon rather than accept an acceptable risk, and who let that single quiet discovery reshape, if only slightly, if only enough to matter in one specific negotiation, the kind of man he chose to become in a boardroom. No one outside that boardroom would ever remember. There was the century that had simply, quietly, without any particular cruelty intended, moved on without waiting for a king who assumed his genius would outlast the passage of years on its own, and the slow, humbling correction he received not through defeat in battle, but through the plain, patient demonstration that adaptability, the very quality he had mocked as amateurish so many trials earlier, was the only currency that had ever actually kept its value across 100 changing years. There was the student, younger than any other version of this rival this story visited, who built her earliest defenses out of salvaged scrap and outmatched engineers with every resource Doom's kingdom could provide, and who reminded him, whether either of them ever said so out loud, of a boy who once watched his own father humiliated by men with more title and less skill, standing in a Latverian encampment that the state around it had never once bothered to fully see. There was the reality that called itself ordinary, where a public disgraced doom, read as an ending, was, in the quiet, unwatched months beneath the public record, actually a slow, patient act of rebuilding, proof, offered late and at real cost, that isolation and exhaustion are not, in fact, the same condition, however similar they can look from the outside, from a war room, from a file built entirely out of what the world happened to be watching closely enough to record. There was the war that looked for one long night like a clean and total victory, and that ended instead with a sentence spoken quietly in a ruined command center over a defeated man Doom found, in the moment that mattered most, that he was not yet prepared to lose. And there was the season stranger than any of the others, the season when the world believed the man in the armor was simply gone, and a king who had spent decades insisting that rival was beneath him went, alone, without an audience, without a crown to make it easier, into a quiet workshop and finished as best he could the work another man could no longer finish himself. Say the whole of it now, gathered together, one final time, in the slowest and gentlest form this story has to offer, across every single one of these realities, across every version of the man Doom insisted at the very beginning of this long telling, was not his equal but merely his inconvenience. The same pattern kept repeating, patient and quiet and entirely indifferent to how many times a king who prided himself on solving every equation life presented him with kept failing trial after trial, reality after reality, to solve this one. It was never really about the armor. This story has said that in other words before, but it deserves saying once more. Here, near the very end, as plainly and as slowly as this whole telling can manage, the armor was only ever the visible part, the part easy to study, easy to reverse engineer, easy to mistake for the whole of what made this rival worth the trouble of a lifetime's attention. The actual advantage, the one thing Doom's genius, for all its vastness, for all the centuries and realities it has been tested against, could never quite fully account for, was smaller than any weapon and far harder to copy. A willingness, renewed over and over in circumstance after circumstance, to keep choosing the costly right thing quietly without needing anyone to see it happen, long after certainty had run out and long before any guarantee of reward had arrived to make the choosing easier. Doom built an empire on being right the first time, every time, and on making the world watch him be right. Every single version of his rival in this long story built something else instead. Smaller, slower, far less certain of itself in the moment, and across every single trial this essay has gathered here tonight, somehow impossibly more durable than anything a crown alone could ever have purchased. That is the whole of it. That is the entire long shape of this rivalry, told as slowly and as completely as one evening allows. Let it settle now, the way everything in this story has eventually always settled, not into a victory for either man and not into a defeat either, but into something quieter than both of those words, something closer to two old rivals finally, after all this time, understanding exactly how much of themselves they had each spent across every reality, learning from the other without ever once agreeing to call it that. Chapter 16a, One Last Account Before the Door Closes. There is one more small piece of the record worth setting down here gently before this long story finally closes its own door behind it. Long after both men had, in their own separate ways, grown old inside the many versions of themselves this essay has tried to gather. Long after the wars, the alliances, the quiet unwatched season in a private workshop, the small unmarked room that two frightened officials once claimed independently to have glimpsed only a single time apiece. A final piece of correspondence survives in an archive neither government has ever fully explained how the public came to access. It is short. It is, characteristically for both men, guarded almost to the point of saying nothing at all. And it is, this story believes, the truest single artifact this whole long history has to offer, precisely because of how little it insists on. It is a note, handwritten, unsigned in any way that would hold up as formal proof of authorship, found tucked among personal effects that later passed, through channels this story will not speculate about further, into an archive dedicated to preserving exactly this kind of unofficial, half-accidental history. It reads in its entirety, translated here from the original Latvian into English with as much care as this telling can manage. I have spent a long life being right about nearly everything I have ever studied. You were the one thing I studied longest and understood least, and I find at the end of it that I do not regret the time. No reply survives if one was ever written at all. Perhaps none was needed. Perhaps by the time that note found its way to wherever it was meant to go, both men had long since said everything that needed saying, in the quieter, more durable language this whole story has been trying to describe from its very first chapter onward, not in words most of the time, but in choices. A weapon killed rather than shipped, a cure offered instead of a killing blow, an armor worn quietly, without permission, to finish another man's unfinished work, a single sentence, "Trust me," and a single silent step backward in a crisis neither of them chose, that neither of them ever fully explained afterward, and neither of them, as far as the record shows, ever needed to. Let that be the last of it. Let the note stand here, near the very end, exactly as plain and as quiet as it survived. No grand reconciliation, no final battle, No dramatic scene built for a camera that was never actually there to record any of this in the first place. Just two old rivals, each grown old inside their own long, complicated, imperfect version of themselves, finding at the end of a story that spanned realities and decades and every version of a mask either man ever wore, that the truest thing left to say to each other was also the simplest: I do not regret the time. Somewhere, tonight, in whichever version of this long story you have carried with you towards sleep, let that be enough. From here forward, let every sentence take its time. There is no more ground left to cover, no more battles to stage, no more reversals waiting to surprise you. What remains is only the slow work of settling, of letting a long story come gently to its close, the way a held breath finally quietly lets itself go. It is worth pausing one more time on just how many separate versions of this rivalry this essay has now gathered. The ultimate war, the Extremis theft, the forced alliance in a crisis neither man chose, the superior season, the son who found his father's old files, the century that moved on without waiting, the student who reminded a king of the boy he once was, the reality that called itself ordinary, the war that became a false peak, and the long quiet season in a workshop no one was watching. 10 separate trials across 10 separate versions of a single relationship, and in every one of them, without exception, the same pattern holding steady underneath all the surface variation: contempt, meeting a quality it could not quite categorize, again and again, until contempt itself began, slowly, reluctantly, to wear thin. That repetition is not an accident of the telling. It is the entire point of telling it this way, gathered slowly, one trial at a time, rather than compressed into a single dramatic summary that might have been easier to deliver but far less true to how something like this actually happens in a long life. Respect, of the kind this story has traced, rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates quietly, trial by trial, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow-moving river, until one day, without any single dramatic event marking the change, the ground underneath a person's oldest certainties has simply permanently shifted. There is no single, final battle that closes the story of Victor Von Doom and every version of the man who has worn the Iron Man armor. That is, itself, one of the truest things this whole long history has to teach, if you are willing to sit with it, rather than reach past it towards something more conclusive. Some rivalries end. This one, across every reality this story has visited, simply continues, quieter with each passing year, the way a fire continues long after the flames have stopped being the interesting part of it, banked down into something that still, if you hold your hand close enough, you can feel giving off heat. In the years after Stark's return, after the quiet reckoning that this story described in its previous chapter, the two men do not become allies. Not in any sense that would satisfy a story looking for a tidy ending. There are more conflicts. Doom, whatever brief season of quiet stewardship he passed through while wearing another man's mantle, does not become a gentler king. Latveria remains what it has always been. A nation built and held together by one man's absolute and largely unaccountable will, and Doom returns, in time, to the same patterns of ambition and control that defined him long before any of this story began. He schemes again, he threatens again. On at least 2 further occasions, recorded across different timelines and different tellings, he and Stark find themselves once more on opposite sides of a conflict large enough to threaten more than either of their individual prides. But something has changed, quietly, permanently, underneath all of it, and the record shows it clearly enough that even historians who prefer not to speculate about interior lives have felt comfortable naming it. The old certainty is gone. The dismissive line Doom used to reach for so easily, "He is not my equal, he is my inconvenience," never appears again in any surviving record in any language from that point forward. In its place, across years of subsequent encounters, a different phrase begins recurring in Doom's private assessments, one this story has been quietly building towards since its very earliest chapters, though it takes this long, this many trials, this many false peaks, and one long private season of unglamorous, unwitnessed work for Doom to finally, fully arrive at it. He is the one mind on this earth I have never fully solved. Say it slowly. It is not a boast, though a lesser telling of this story might be tempted to treat it as one. It is closer, by the time it finally appears in the historical record, to something like an admission, the specific, hard-won admission of a man who has spent his entire existence organizing the world into categories of things he has mastered and things he intends to master, discovering late, and only through years of accumulated defeat and unexpected private grace, that there exists at least one variable in his life that refuses, no matter how thoroughly he studies it, to resolve into something he can finally, fully own. Somewhere, in whichever timeline you prefer to imagine this taking place, it is evening again, always evening, in the parts of this story that matter most, as if the two men at its center have only ever really understood each other in the hours when the rest of the world has gone quiet enough to let them. Perhaps it is a rooftop, the kind Stark has always preferred for the particular privacy that height provides, the city below settling into its long, low hum of traffic and distant voices and the occasional siren fading into somewhere else. Perhaps Doom stands some careful distance away, as he always does, close enough to speak, far enough to retreat from without it looking like retreat. Neither man is fighting. Neither man, in this particular imagined evening, is even talking, not at first. There is only the wind moving slowly across the rooftop and the last grey light going soft and blue at the edges of the buildings, and the long, unhurried, oddly companionable silence of two men who have spent decades learning, the hard way, exactly how much they still don't know about each other, and have, somewhere along that long road, stopped minding it quite so much. This is not a memory the historical record confirms in any specific dated way. It is offered here the way this whole story has occasionally offered its quieter moments, not as fact exactly, but as the truest shape the facts seem to be pointing toward when you step back far enough to see the whole long pattern of it. It is worth returning one final time gently, without urgency, to the question this story opened with all those pages ago, the dismissive judgment spoken so early, so confidently, and disproven so slowly, so completely, across every chapter that followed it. He is not my equal, he is my inconvenience. It was not true. This story has said that sentence, or some close variation of it, several times now, and it is worth saying once more here, softly, at the very end, because the repetition itself is part of the point. A refrain, said often enough, in nearly the same words each time, stops being merely a fact you are told, and starts becoming something closer to a truth you simply carry with you, quietly, the way you carry the sound of rain on a window you have listened to many times before. The quality Doom dismissed at the very beginning of this long story as a toymaker's amateur scruple, the willingness to kill a working weapon rather than accept an acceptable risk, the willingness to surrender hard-won control rather than betray people who trusted him, the willingness to keep rebuilding, slowly, imperfectly, at real personal cost, rather than simply declare a version of himself finished and move on. That quality was never, at any point across this entire long history, a weakness at all. It was the hidden architecture underneath every single victory Tony Stark, in every version of himself this story has visited, ever managed to claim against a rival who so consistently, so confidently, believed himself the superior mind in the room. Say it once more in its final form, the clearest version this story has to offer. Doom's genius demanded certainty before it acted, and mistook Stark's willingness to act without certainty for recklessness. It took him decades, across multiple realities, through theft and war, and one long, unwitnessed season of quiet, unglamorous work, to understand that acting without certainty, and then having the discipline to correct course honestly when the acting proved wrong, was never a lesser kind of genius at all. It was, across every single trial this story has traced, the only kind that ever actually worked. This is not, in the end, a story about who wins. Doom does not lose, not permanently, not in any way that ends his reign or humbles him beyond recognition. That would be a different, tidier, less honest story than the one the record actually supports. And Stark does not simply triumph cleanly in every chapter. He loses allies, loses control, loses, for a long, unbearable season, even his own presence in the world, before finally, quietly, coming home to a mantle someone else had been carrying in his absence. It is, instead, a story about what happens when contempt meets a pattern it cannot make sense of over and over, across enough years and enough realities that even the most certain mind on Earth eventually has to stop calling it an inconvenience and start calling it, honestly, at long last, a mystery worth respecting. There is no final battle waiting at the end of this story, and there does not need to be one. Some rivalries resolve with a single decisive blow. This one, across every version of these two men this essay has followed, resolves instead the way most long, complicated, genuinely important relationships in a real life actually resolve, not with an ending, but with a kind of settling, a lowering of the volume. A war that continues, here and there, in smaller and smaller ways, alongside a private understanding that neither man will ever fully admit to the other, but that both of them, by every account this story has been able to gather, quietly, privately, carry with them into every single subsequent encounter. If you take only one thing from this long telling, let it be this, offered slowly, one final time. The world is full of people who will look at careful, quiet, unglamorous restraint and call it weakness, the way Doom did for so long, so confidently, before the whole weight of this story finally taught him otherwise. It is not weakness, it has never been weakness. It is, across every reality this story has visited, across every version of the man in the armor, the single hardest and most durable kind of strength there is. The strength to keep choosing the costly right thing quietly, without an audience, long after anyone with less of it would have simply stopped trying. Doom, in the end, never fully stops being Doom. That is not a happy ending exactly, but it was never meant to be one. What he becomes, instead, slowly, across decades and defeats and one long, unwitnessed season in a quiet workshop, is a man who finally, after everything, understands the size of what he spent so long dismissing. And somewhere, in whichever timeline you choose to imagine this settling into for the last time tonight, two old rivals stand a careful distance apart, on a rooftop, or in a ruined command center long since rebuilt, or simply in the quiet space of two minds that have spent decades trying and failing and trying again to fully solve each other, and neither one, for once, feels any particular need to speak. There is no need to remember every trial by name, every reality by its particular quirks of history, every small quiet room this story has asked you to picture along the way. Let the details go, if they are already going. What the story hopes stays with you instead, past the point where the details themselves have softened and slipped away into whatever comes after listening, is only the shape underneath them, the slow tide of it, the patient repetition, the sense of something vast and certain finally, gently, learning to be a little less certain, a little more willing to sit inside not knowing, the way you too might be learning right now, in this last quiet stretch before sleep, to let go of needing to hold onto anything at all. The next story in this series returns to a different kind of underestimated mind entirely, a different kind of quiet victory, waiting, whenever you're ready, on another night. Let that be the shape you carry with you tonight. If you carry anything from this long telling at all, not a war won, not a war lost, but the slow, quiet, unglamorous accumulation of 1,000 small choices made without an audience, that turned out, in the end, to matter more than any crown, any armor, any single dramatic victory ever could. That is not only true of two rivals in a story built from realities that never quite existed, it tends to be true as well of quieter, smaller, far more ordinary lives, the ones lived mostly in rooms no one else is watching, where the only witness to a costly right choice is the person who made it, and perhaps whatever small, patient part of the world was paying quiet attention all along. Rest now. There is nothing left in this story that needs your attention any longer, nothing left to track, nothing left to resolve. It has already resolved slowly, quietly, the way these things tend to, somewhere in the long telling behind you. For now, only the rain and the low hum of a city settling towards sleep, and the door, at long last, closing softly behind you.